I'm Adam Goldfine. You might pay more than you should. And we're talking about DUI. Bubba, how much does it cost the average? I'm not saying somebody goes and they retain you or they retain the partner of a firm. If you're pulled over for a DUI between, and let's rack it all up, between the fines, between the legal representation, between possibly the additional insurance expenses, what's the typical expense of a DUI?
Well, just the things you mentioned, depending on the person, that could be anywhere from $10,000 to over $100,000. Because I represented a dentist who had adult-age children in college and things, and his increase in insurance, if he had a DUI, was $56,000 a year.
Wow!
So he ended up having to fight that case. He was from South Carolina, actually, but the cost, the direct costs are massive. But for most people, it's the job. If you lose the job, or you get demoted, or you can't be promoted, or you get kicked out of the military that you were planning on getting your 20 years in, those things are $1 million cost.
And we're going to talk about the consequences. You have a list of the 89 top consequences of DUI, but I've been teasing people with the field sobriety. I know when I got all of your information, I mean, even as an attorney, I'll tell you, I didn't know these things, and I thought it was important enough to kind of stop and say, hey, what are your rights in the state of Georgia? What do you have to do? Where can you stop the line and say, you know what, I want to exercise my rights?
The field test, every single one of them, that includes the eye test, the walk and turn, the one-leg stand, the partial alphabet, leaning your head back and trying to touch your nose, any type of verbal or nonverbal physical test, all of those, including the handheld Alka-Sensor, the little small thing about the size of a camera, all voluntary, all optional. There is no penalty, no license penalty for not doing it. Nothing.
So if I say, I'm not interested, or I don't feel I should have to, or I opt out. Can that be used against me though, for exercising that right?
The Georgia Court of Appeals so far has allowed it to be mentioned in court. Many states don't allow it to even be mentioned because if you opt to not take a voluntary test, why should it be used against you?
It's voluntary, right?
And worse than that, Clemson University studied the field test. These are PhDs at Clemson who had no connection to law enforcement. And they found that an error was made in the field test about 90% of the time. And the other thing they found out is that officers made the wrong arrest decision off videotapes of impaired people 46% of the time. So if the field tests are that inaccurate, number one, but number two, the field tests are designed to fail unless you're a gymnast, or I had one professional cheerleader that was able to pass them flawlessly. But most people, even ex-athletes, cannot do them without problems.
You know, I was sitting in a continuing legal education course on drunk driving a few years ago, and they were talking about the number of steps. Like, I forgot the number, but it was like make 9 steps and turn. And the examiner was saying, well, the way they define it is if you don't pivot on the exact counted step, you were wrong. And even in my mind, as I'm sitting there stone sober, I would have failed just on the count.
Correct. Well, this is the thing. On the one-leg stand,
where
you have to raise one foot and keep the other one in a certain position and count and do all these different things, there's 122 possible errors in a 30-count, 30-second test. That's what they're looking for. If you make 2 errors out of 122, you have failed according to the police. Well, you would never enter college knowing you had to make a 98.7 just to pass the course.
Right.
Who would go to that college? I know I wouldn't.
So what happens then if I decline that and then they say, okay, well, I have a breathalyzer test. I'd like you to submit to that. Do I have to take the breath test there, or what happens at that point?
That is also optional, 100% optional. Nothing you do at the roadway like that is going to affect your ability to drive. Now, if you get arrested, and many officers will arrest you because their instructions are, if they smell alcohol or you admit alcohol, or if they suspect some other impairing substance, usually alcohol, and you don't take any of their voluntary tests, you go to jail. That's their standing marching order.
So you should expect then, if you decline, that in all likelihood you're going to go to jail.
Right, but you can also expect if you try to do them, you're going to fail, you're going to jail anyway.
So you're going to jail either way.
You're going to have all that evidence on video that they're going to use to say this is an impaired person because of X, Y, and Z, and that doesn't mean you're impaired. It just means you're either a clutch or you're overweight or you're nervous, or it's cold, or you got high heels on, or one of the many other things that can cause you not to be able to do agility exercises.
I mean, it could be the slant of the roadway that you're on. It could be the lighting. It could be 1,001 things.
Well, the roadway can never be perfectly level because the water wouldn't run off. So you have both slope and grade.
Right.
It's moving in two different directions. And on top of that, you've got gravel, you've got glass.
That's why I'm glad I hired you. It's like,
Well,
hey, let me ask you, if folks, as we're talking about this, if they want to check out, let's say, one of your videos or your website for more information, where should they go?
Well, YouTube is probably the quickest way because everybody knows that. You could just put in common words like Atlanta DUI attorney or lawyer, or just put in William Head, William C. Head. You can put in Bubba Head.
We'll find you.
videos. Oh yeah.
All right, so the test, if once I'm brought to the jail and they book me and now they want me to take a breath test, do I have to or can I refuse?
Well, they have to first read you a card, and this is really important. The implied consent. Nobody knows what that means because nobody was in school and the teacher said, I'm going to Kroger today and I'm going to give implied consent. Well, that just doesn't happen. So implied consent means that there's a legal myth that by virtue of the fact that you use the highways in Georgia, you have implicitly given your consent to be tested if an officer suspects you're impaired. And if the officer does not read the card at the roadway, with rare exceptions such as injury, then they're not entitled to get any blood, breath, or urine test from you if they don't read it at the roadway in Georgia. Many other states, they can read it either place or they can give it to you in writing.
So it's right there at the car?
Right there at the car as soon as the cuffs go on, as soon as possible. But if they read you that card, what you're being told basically is, if you don't take the test, you could lose your right to drive for 1 full year just for not taking the test.
Now this is not the Miranda warnings.
They won't give you Miranda because they're not going to ask you questions that require you to confess anything.
Okay.
They're simply asking a yes or no question. Will you take the test or not?
Explain to everybody the difference between whether or not you've actually drank something, you're impaired, or your blood alcohol levels over a certain line. What is the rule for having a DUI?
Well, again, drinking and driving for anyone 21 and over is not a crime. If you're under 21, just drinking or possessing alcohol is a crime.
Right.
Just consider if you're under 21, it's like you had dope with you. You're going to go to jail one way or the other for simply having it with you if you're behind the wheel of a car. So the person over 21 typically could have a glass of wine with dinner, and you're not going to be impaired by that. And as long as it's not too big a glass of wine, because some of the restaurants pour too much.
Right.
But the bottom line to it is that if the officer smells it on your breath and you say, I had 1 drink, the officers don't care what you say for the number. You could say 1, you could say 2, and they're going to start trying to give you some evaluations. And those evaluations, if they say that you are likely to be above the limit, you're going to jail.
All right. You know, do me a favor, share a story with me about that gentleman that you had represented, the one in the pickup truck. Okay, so if you could paint the picture of this gentleman. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to play the 911 tape of after he had gotten involved in the accident, so people could also understand how serious this situation is.
Well, he was actually in a Pontiac, but
Okay.
he was out at a co-worker's party, birthday party, and didn't know his way around. Was from another state. He was from Florida. He had his best friend with him who had also moved here from Florida to work in Atlanta area. And on his way back to try to find his way into Metro Atlanta where he lived, he was in Forsyth County. He was coming around a sweeping right turn on a dark country road in Forsyth County when a deer appeared from his right toward the curb and came out in front of him, and he tried to go around the deer. But not knowing the roadway, he didn't know this was a 90-degree turn. By the way, this was the 5th person killed in that same turn. But his passenger, unfortunately, was killed in the accident, a best friend, and that was partially due to the fact he was not seat belted. But because the young man had been drinking, even though the test result in the middle of trial was excluded, and they could not convict him of being above the legal limit, then the person was charged with vehicular homicide, which per injury or death is 15 years in prison. And they stacked that 15 on top of 15. So if you have 5 or 6 injured people in 2 cars and you're suspected of being DUI, with its 7 people, that's 105 years in jail you could spend.
So they're not running concurrently, they're just consecutive.
It's up to the judge, but I know of a person who called me, I didn't represent the man, but as an attorney from Florida said, would you try to help this young man? He had an attorney who pled him guilty to 4 counts of vehicle homicide, and he's serving 60 years.
This is before you got the case.
Right, he was trying to see if I could figure out a way to help him. But if you get a 60-year sentence in Georgia, you're going to serve 90%, so he had 54 years to serve for that offense.
And now, was this attorney that had pled him out to these 4 counts, did he have any experience doing this?
Well, I didn't know that attorney, but I knew the one who was calling from Florida was an international group I'm a member of, and he wanted to know, is there anything you can do to help him? And as I told him, and I'll tell the listeners, once you put it down as a guilty plea, if you're represented by an attorney, it's like you put concrete down, and once it hardens, it's very hard to jackhammer that up. So I don't go in to do those, because I think it's a very low chance you're going to overturn a conviction if you pled guilty or were found guilty if you're represented by an attorney, no matter what the attorney's qualifications are.
You know, and this is interesting because it really brings to the next level the aggravation factors, right? So we have one thing where you've talked about, okay, age is a factor, and there's also a factor whether or not you're a commercial driver, right? If you're driving a big rig or you're just driving a passenger vehicle, like if I'm just driving coming home from dinner. But there are also other aggravating factors, such as if it's you're a multiple offender or if you injure somebody. Can you give us a little bit of that as well?
Well, Georgia has for many years had mandatory minimum sentencing, meaning the judge can go no lower than a certain number of days in jail, community service hours. All this punishment is stacked up. The more times you've been involved with a DUI, more likely you're going to get very serious sentence out of it. And so the law changed in July of 2008 to not just look back 5 years for mandatory minimum sentencing. It now looks back 10 years. So you can be punished very harshly. And the law also in 2008 added a felony, so that if you, from July 1, 2008 and forward, that part is prospective. It doesn't go back and pick up old DUIs. If you have 4 or more since July of 2008, then you can be charged as a felon, and the punishment is very severe.
And what if, God forbid, you're driving and you're over the limit and you hurt someone? Like you said, it could be a pedestrian, it could be someone on a bicycle, it could be somebody in a vehicle. You have a motor vehicle accident with another vehicle. What happens?
Very good question. That's called serious injury by vehicle. Right. In some states it's called vehicular manslaughter or other titles, but in Georgia the same 15 years is possible for that. The minimum is 2, the maximum is 15. On a death case it's 3 to 15, but you never see judges much giving 3 years out. Usually, like in Gwinnett County, the more normal sentence is 6 to 8 years on a first offense.
The thing that I think is amazing to me, and I'm sure the folks listening, it's amazing because, you know, I think most people consider themselves a good person. You don't think of themselves as a criminal. You say, well, I know I'm not going to burglarize someone. I know I'm not going to assault or rape or murder. I'm not going to do that, right? But if you sit back and folks are candid with themselves as they're driving, and don't answer it, but you guys know how many times in your life you've possibly done this, or how many times that you were driving and you said I shouldn't be, or you were in the vehicle with someone that shouldn't be. And it brings up not only our behavior as adults, but you know, you had mentioned during the break that this is it's a really a tremendous problem for teens, and it's also, and you know, I guess guys in their 20s, right? The younger you are, and then it's also certain occupations tend to have this, you know, in a higher frequency.
Right. People who work in restaurants and bars are the #1 category. If you broke it down to who gets DUIs, they're the highest number because there's many, many of them. And they tend to have patterns of, at the end of the night, having a few drinks before they go. Worst time you could possibly do it because it doesn't dissipate from your system.
All right, so here's what I'd like to do. When we come back, let's play the 911 tape.
That's fine.
Let's listen to the pain and the anguish. What we want to prevent you or any of your loved ones from ever having to experience. You're listening to Adam Goldfein. I am speaking with William Head here on the Adam Goldfein Show on AM 750 and now 95.5 FM, News Talk WSB.